The first gunshot split the dawn air just as Hannah Lawson reached the edge of the creek, her heart hammering wildly in her chest. The second shot came closer, whistling past her ear and splintering the bark of a nearby cottonwood. She didn't dare look back to see how close her pursuers had come. All that mattered was getting across that water and into the thicket beyond. Montana Territory, 1878, a harsh land where justice was often dispensed from the barrel of a gun. Hannah hadn't meant to witness the murder behind Dawson's saloon, but she had. And now the three men responsible were determined she wouldn't live to testify. She plunged into the frigid creek, gasping as the water soaked her dress and dragged at her movements. Halfway across, her foot caught on a slippery rock. Pain exploded through her ankle as she tumbled forward, the current immediately pulling at her skirts. With desperate strokes, she managed to reach the opposite bank, dragging herself onto the muddy shore as more shots peppered the water behind her. "She went that way, don't let her get away," the voices carried across the water, harsh and determined. Hannah struggled to stand, but her ankle collapsed beneath her weight. Tears of pain and desperation stung her eyes as she tried again, only to fall once more. "Need a hand there, miss." The deep voice came from directly above her. Hannah looked up, squinting against the rising sun, to find a tall figure on horseback looking down at her. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out the glint of concerned eyes and the square line of his jaw. "They're coming," she gasped, glancing fearfully across the creek. "Three men. They're trying to kill me." Without hesitation, the stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, crouching beside her. "Can you walk?" Hannah tried once more to put weight on her injured ankle, only to bite back a cry of pain. "I can't walk," she admitted, desperation clear in her voice. The cowboy answered without hesitation, his voice steady and sure. "I'll carry you all my life." Before she could process his peculiar choice of words, he swept her into his arms and deposited her on his horse, swinging up behind her in one smooth motion. They were moving before Hannah could catch her breath, the stranger's strong arms on either side of her as he guided the horse into the shelter of the pine forest. "Name's Garrett O'Malley," he said, his voice close to her ear as they rode. "And you'd be?" "Hannah Lawson," she managed, clinging to the saddle horn as the horse navigated the uneven terrain with surprising speed. "Those men back there, I witnessed them murder someone." "Sheriff Calloway's looking for witnesses to that saloon killing," Garrett said, guiding the horse around a fallen log. "That'd be you, I reckon," Hannah nodded, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "They've been hunting me since yesterday. I tried hiding at the livery, but they found me this morning." Garrett's arms tightened slightly around her. "Well, they'll have to go through me to get to you now, Miss Lawson." "My place is about 5 miles ahead. We'll get you patched up, then figure what's next." The sound of distant hoofbeats made them both tense. Garrett veered off the trail, guiding his horse through a nearly invisible game path that wound deeper into the forest. They rode in tense silence for nearly an hour, the cowboy occasionally stopping to listen before continuing on. Eventually, they emerged into a small clearing where a modest cabin stood beside a corral containing several horses. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, and a large dog bounded toward them, barking a welcome. "Home, sweet home," Garrett said, bringing the horse to a stop. "Let's get you inside and have a look at that ankle." When he lifted her down, Hannah couldn't help noticing his gentle touch despite his weathered appearance. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 25 or so, with striking blue eyes and a face tanned by years in the sun. "Thank you," she said as he carried her toward the cabin. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "Been in the right place at the right time before," he replied with a small smile. "Never for someone as pretty as you, though." The cabin door swung open before they reached it, and an older man with silver hair and a bushy mustache appeared, eyebrows raising at the sight of them. "Brought home more than just supplies, I see," he said, stepping aside to let them enter. "Hannah Lawson, this is Joe Blackstone." "He's teaching me the ranching business," Garrett explained. Joe, Miss Lawson here is in a spot of trouble. She witnessed that killing in town. Joe's expression turned grave. The Jenkins murder, those are dangerous men you've crossed, miss. He gestured toward a small sofa near the fireplace. Set her down there, Garrett. I'll fetch some bandages for that ankle. As Garrett gently placed her on the sofa, Hannah caught sight of her reflection in a small mirror hanging nearby. Her honey blonde hair had escaped its pins, hanging in damp tangles around her face. Her blue dress was torn and muddy, and her face was scratched from branches she'd pushed through during her escape. You're safe now, Garrett said, seemingly reading her troubled thoughts. Those men won't find you here. They won't stop looking, Hannah replied softly. I'm the only witness. Then we'll figure something out, he said with quiet confidence. For now, let's tend to that ankle. Joe returned with bandages and a basin of cool water. Hannah winced as Garrett carefully removed her boot and rolled down her stocking to reveal the swollen, bruised ankle beneath. Doesn't look broken, Joe observed, but it's a bad sprain. You won't be walking on it for at least a week. A week? Hannah's voice rose in alarm. I can't stay here that long. I'm putting you both in danger. Nearest town's 2 days' ride, Joe said matter-of-factly. And those men are probably watching all the roads. Unless you've got wings hidden under that dress, you're staying put until that ankle heals. As Garrett gently wrapped her ankle, Hannah found herself studying his face. There was a kindness in his eyes that contrasted with the hardness of his jaw and the small scar that ran along his right cheekbone. His hands, though calloused from ranch work, moved with surprising gentleness. How did you come to be at the creek this morning? She asked. Was heading to town for supplies, he replied. Heard the shots and went to investigate. Good thing I did. Joe snorted. Always playing the hero, this one. Nearly got himself killed last month stopping a runaway wagon. Garrett shrugged, securing the bandage around Hannah's ankle. Just doing what needed doing. Now you must be hungry, Miss Lawson. We don't have much, but there's some stew left from last night. The thought of food reminded Hannah that she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. That would be wonderful, thank you. While Joe fetched the food, Garrett built up the fire and brought Hannah a blanket. You're shivering, he explained, draping it around her shoulders. Their fingers brushed as she accepted the blanket, and Hannah felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Thank you again, she said softly. For everything. His blue eyes met hers, and for a moment, something passed between them, a connection Hannah couldn't explain but felt to her core. Then Joe returned with a steaming bowl of stew, and the moment passed. As Hannah ate, the men discussed what to do. Sheriff Calloway needs to know what she saw, Joe said. But those killers are Randall Tucker's men. Tucker practically owns the town. The railroad man, Hannah asked. What would he have to do with killing a saloon keeper? Jenkins wasn't just a saloon keeper, Garrett explained. He was organizing the small ranchers to fight Tucker's land grabs, railroads coming through, and Tucker wants to control all the land along the proposed route. Hannah's spoon halted halfway to her mouth. So this is about more than just what I witnessed. I'm afraid so, Joe said grimly. Tucker's been squeezing folks out for months. Jenkins was the only one standing up to him. And now he's dead, Hannah said softly. And I'm the only one who can prove Tucker's men did it. Garrett leaned forward, his expression serious. Which is why we need to get you to the federal marshal in Helena. Sheriff Calloway's a good man, but he doesn't have the power to stand against Tucker. The marshal does. Helena's 4 days' ride, Joe pointed out. With her ankle and Tucker's men searching. We'll manage, Garrett said firmly, but not today. Today Miss Lawson rests. Despite her protests, Hannah found herself grateful for the decision. The terror of the morning, combined with her sleepless night hiding in the livery, had left her exhausted. As the men went outside to tend to the horses, she allowed her eyes to close just for a moment. She woke to find the cabin bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. A quilt had been tucked around her and the fire was burning low. Outside, she could hear Garrett's voice as he spoke to the horses in the corral. Hannah sat up carefully, testing her ankle. The pain was still there, but the swelling seemed reduced. She swung her legs to the floor and attempted to stand, using the sofa arm for support. She managed 2 hobbling steps before her ankle protested sharply. Gasping, she started to fall, only to find herself caught by strong arms as Garrett appeared seemingly from nowhere. "Whoa there," he said, steadying her. "That ankle won't be ready for walking just yet." Hannah found herself unusually aware of his proximity, of the scent of leather and pine that clung to him, of the strength in the arms that held her. "I was just testing it," she explained, her voice coming out softer than she'd intended. "And how'd that work out for you?" he asked, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Despite everything, Hannah found herself smiling back. "Not well," she admitted. Instead of releasing her, Garrett surprised her by lifting her into his arms again. "Let's get you outside for a bit. Sitting in the fresh air might do you good." He carried her to a rough-hewn bench outside the cabin, setting her down carefully before taking a seat beside her. The view from the homestead was breathtaking rolling hills covered in pine, with mountains rising blue-gray in the distance. "It's beautiful here," Hannah said after a moment. "That it is," Garrett agreed. "Been working this land with Joe for 3 years now, starting to feel like home." "Where were you before?" A shadow crossed his face. "Everywhere and nowhere. Rode with the army for a spell after the war, then drifted, taking whatever work came along. Met Joe when some rustlers were giving him trouble, stuck around after we dealt with them." "And now you're helping another stranger in trouble," Hannah observed. Garrett turned to look at her, his expression suddenly serious. "You're not just any stranger, Miss Lawson." "Hannah," she corrected softly. "Please call me Hannah." "Hannah," he repeated, her name sounding different in his deep voice. "I meant what I said at the creek. I'll help you through this." "That's not exactly what you said," she reminded him, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. Garrett looked momentarily confused, then realization dawned. He chuckled, a warm sound that made Hannah's heart skip. "Ah, yes, something about carrying you all my life, wasn't it? Suppose that was a bit forward of me." "It was unexpected," Hannah admitted, "but comforting in a strange way." Their eyes met, and Hannah felt that same inexplicable connection she'd experienced earlier. Something about this man, this quiet cowboy who'd risked himself to save her, stirred feelings she hadn't expected. The moment was broken by Joe calling from the corral. "Riders coming." 3 of them from the east. Garrett was on his feet instantly, one hand going to the revolver at his hip. "Get inside," he told Hannah, already helping her up. "Is it them?" she asked, fear clutching at her heart. "We'll see," he replied grimly. "Joe, get Miss Lawson to the root cellar." "I'll handle this." Before she could protest, Joe was there, supporting her as they hurried back to the cabin. At the rear of the main room, he pulled up a trapdoor revealing a small storage cellar. "Down you go," he said, helping her navigate the steep steps. "Stay quiet no matter what you hear." The cellar was cool and smelled of earth and stored vegetables. A single lantern hung from a hook, which Joe lit before climbing back up. "Garrett knows what he's doing," he assured her. "Been in tighter spots than this." The trapdoor closed, leaving Hannah in the dim light of the lantern. She could hear muffled voices above, then the sound of boots on the porch. Her heart pounded as she strained to make out words. "Looking for a woman," a harsh voice was saying. "Blonde, blue dress, killed a man in town." "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," came Garrett's steady reply. "Just me and my partner here for the past week. Mind if we have a look around?" "Yes, I do mind," Garrett's voice hardened. "This is private property." "We've got authority from Mr. Tucker. Tucker doesn't own this land," Garrett interrupted. "And unless you've got a warrant from Sheriff Calloway, you've got no right to search anything." There was a tense silence, then the first voice again, lower and more threatening. "You're making a mistake, Cowboy. Nobody stands against Randall Tucker." "Wouldn't be the first mistake I've made," Garrett replied evenly. "Probably won't be the last. Now, I suggest you gentlemen be on your way before we have a real problem." Hannah held her breath, waiting for the sound of gunshots. Instead, after another long moment, she heard the creak of saddle leather and the retreating sound of hoofbeats. The trapdoor opened several minutes later, and Garrett's face appeared. "All clear," he said, extending his hand to help her up. "They've gone, but they'll be back." Hannah grasped his hand, allowing him to pull her up and lift her from the cellar. "You stood up to them," she said, finding herself reluctant to let go of his hand once she was seated again. "Most men wouldn't. Most men haven't seen what happens when bullies like Tucker go unchallenged," Garrett replied, his expression darkening. "I have." Joe appeared in the doorway, rifle in hand. "They're heading back toward town, but I don't trust him. One of us should keep watch tonight." "I'll take first shift," Garrett said. "We need to move out at first light. They'll be back with more men tomorrow." Hannah looked between the two men, overwhelmed by their willingness to risk themselves for her. "I can't ask you to do this. Tucker's men will kill you both." "You didn't ask," Garrett reminded her gently. "And as for Tucker's men, they can try." That night, Hannah slept fitfully on the small bed in the cabin's only bedroom, which the men had insisted she take. Her dreams were troubled, filled with pursuing shadows and the sound of gunshots. She woke shortly after midnight to find Garrett sitting by the window, his silhouette outlined against the moonlight. "You should be sleeping," she whispered. He turned, surprise crossing his features. "As should you. How's the ankle?" "Better, I think," she replied, pushing herself up to sitting. "Garrett, I need to ask you something." He moved to sit on the edge of the bed, his face half in shadow. "Ask away." "Why are you really helping me? You don't know me. You're risking everything for a stranger." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. 3 years ago, I watched a man die because I didn't step in when I should have. He was being beaten by a gang of rustlers, and I rode past, telling myself it wasn't my fight." He paused. "Found out later he had a wife and children waiting for him. Never forgave myself for that." Hannah reached out hesitantly, her fingers finding his in the darkness. "So this is about redemption." "Partly," he admitted, "but there's more to it." His hand turned, fingers intertwining with hers. "From the moment I saw you by that creek, something told me you were worth fighting for." Can't explain it better than that. The honesty in his voice touched something deep within Hannah. In the short time she'd known him, Garrett O'Malley had shown more integrity and courage than most men she'd known her entire life. "I was engaged once," she found herself saying. "To the son of a banker back in St. Louis. When my father's business failed, he broke it off. Said he couldn't marry a woman with no prospects." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "Came west to start over, hoping to find work as a schoolteacher. Never expected to witness a murder my first week in town." "His loss," Garrett said simply, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that sent a warm shiver through her. "Any man worth his salt would stand by the woman he loves, prospects or no." The word love hung in the air between them, weighty and significant. Hannah was suddenly, intensely aware of their closeness, of his hand holding hers, of the moonlight silvering his features. "We should both get some rest," Garrett said finally, his voice rougher than before. "Long ride ahead tomorrow." As he moved to stand, Hannah tightened her grip on his hand. "Stay," she whispered. "Just sit with me a while longer." He hesitated, then settled back. "As long as you need." They talked until dawn began to pale the eastern sky about their childhoods, their dreams, the paths that had led them to this moment. Hannah learned that Garrett had grown up on a small farm in Kentucky, that he'd fought for the Union despite his family's Southern sympathies, that he'd wandered westward after the war seeking something he couldn't name. In turn, she told him about her sheltered upbringing in St. Louis, her father's business ventures and eventual bankruptcy, her decision to seek independence in the West rather than live as a poor relation to disapproving aunts. As the first light of dawn filtered through the window, Hannah realized with surprise that her fear had receded. In its place was a strange, fragile hope, not just for survival, but for something more. Joe found them still talking when he came to wake them. If he noticed their clasped hands or the way they quickly moved apart at his entrance, he gave no sign. "Time to move," he said simply. "Packed some provisions." Horses are ready. The plan was straightforward. Joe would create a diversion by riding openly toward town, drawing any watchers after him. Meanwhile, Garrett would take Hannah north through the mountains, using game trails to avoid the main roads on their way to Helena. "You'll need this," Joe said, handing Hannah one of his own shirts and a pair of trousers. "That dress is too visible, and trousers will be easier with that ankle." Dressing was a challenge, but Hannah managed it with determined privacy behind a hanging blanket. The men's clothing felt strange but practical, the rough fabric nothing like the fine cotton and wool she was accustomed to. When she emerged, both men looked at her with surprise. "Well," Joe said finally, "you'd make a passable boy from a distance. Keep that hat pulled low, and you might just fool anyone looking for a young woman." Garrett said nothing, but the approval in his eyes made Hannah stand a little straighter despite the ache in her ankle. Joe departed first, riding openly down the main trail toward town. They waited a tense half-hour, then Garrett helped Hannah onto a sturdy brown mare, showing her how to position her injured ankle in the stirrup to minimize pain. "Ready?" he asked, mounting his own horse. Hannah nodded, tightening her grip on the reins. "As I'll ever be." They rode north, keeping to the cover of the forest whenever possible. Garrett set a careful pace, mindful of Hannah's injury, but they still covered significant ground. By midday, they'd reached the foothills of the mountains, where the pine forest grew denser and the trails narrower. "How's the ankle?" Garrett asked as they paused by a small stream to rest the horses. "Tolerable," Hannah replied, though in truth it throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. "I won't slow us down." Garrett studied her face, clearly seeing through her brave front. Without comment, he dug through his saddlebag and produced a small flask. "Medicinal purposes," he explained, offering it to her. The whiskey burned going down, but Hannah had to admit it helped dull the pain. "Thank you," she said, handing it back. "We'll make camp early tonight," Garrett decided. "There's a hunting cabin another few miles up. Used it last fall during elk season, should be safe enough." As they continued their journey, Hannah found herself watching Garrett, the confident way he sat his horse, the alertness in his posture as he constantly scanned their surroundings, the gentle way he checked on her. In just 2 days, this man had become more important to her than anyone had in years. The hunting cabin was little more than a one-room shelter with a stone fireplace, but after a day in the saddle, it looked like a palace to Hannah. Garrett helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I'll tend the horses," he said, his voice oddly rough. "You get settled inside." The cabin was dusty but sound, with a small cot against one wall and a rough table with 2 chairs. Hannah limped around, exploring the tiny space and finding a few supplies left from previous hunting trips: some coffee, dried beans, and salt. By the time Garrett returned, she had managed to start a small fire in the fireplace. He looked surprised, then pleased. "You're handy to have around, Hannah Lawson." "My father believed in practical education," she replied with a small smile. "Said a woman should know how to take care of herself." "Wise man," Garrett observed, setting down his saddlebags. "I've got some jerky and hardtack, not much of a dinner, but it'll keep us going." They ate simply, sitting before the fire. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the cabin's single window. Despite the rustic surroundings and the danger that still pursued them, Hannah found herself experiencing a curious contentment. "Tell me about your dream," she said suddenly. "After all this is over, what do you want?" Garrett considered the question, absently turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Land of my own," he said finally. "A good herd of cattle, maybe a proper house someday with glass windows and a porch." He glanced at her, then away. "Someone to share it with." The simple admission hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Hannah found herself imagining such a life far from the society constraints of St. Louis, building something real with someone who valued strength and honesty over social position. "What about you?" Garrett asked, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Once you've testified and Tucker's men are behind bars, what then?" "I still hope to teach," she said. Find a town that needs a schoolteacher. She hesitated. Somewhere not too far from here, perhaps. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of possibilities, of futures that might intertwine. The spell was broken by a sound outside the distant crack of a branch. Garrett was on his feet instantly, his hand going to his gun. "Stay here," he whispered, moving silently to the window. Hannah's heart pounded as he peered cautiously through the glass. After a tense moment, his shoulders relaxed slightly. "Deer," he said, turning back to her. "Just a deer passing through." Relief flooded through her, followed by exhaustion. The day's ride had taken more out of her than she'd admitted. Garrett must have noticed, for he gestured to the cot. "You should rest. We've still got at least 2 days' ride ahead." Hannah nodded, suddenly too tired to argue. As she moved toward the cot, her ankle gave way unexpectedly. Garrett caught her before she could fall, his arms strong around her waist. "Easy," he murmured, his face close to hers. Hannah looked up at him, at the concern in his eyes, at the way the firelight played across his features. Without conscious thought, she raised a hand to his face, her fingers tracing the scar on his cheekbone. Garrett went very still, his eyes never leaving hers. "Hannah," he said, her name almost a question. Instead of answering, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. For a heartbeat, he remained frozen, then his arms tightened around her, and he was kissing her back with a passion that stole her breath. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Garrett rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Been wanting to do that since I first saw you," he admitted, his voice rough. "Even when I was covered in creek mud?" Hannah asked, her own voice unsteady. He opened his eyes, a smile touching his lips. "Even then." They spent the night beside the fire, talking, sharing occasional kisses, learning each other in this new way. By unspoken agreement, they went no further, though the desire between them was palpable. There would be time for more, they both sensed, if they survived what was to come. Dawn came too soon, gray light filtering through the cabin window. They prepared to leave in comfortable silence, each aware of the changed nature of their relationship but focused on the journey ahead. The day's ride was harder, the terrain more challenging as they climbed higher into the mountains. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered and the first fat raindrops began to fall. "There's a cave about a mile ahead," Garrett called over the rising wind. "We can wait out the worst of it there." They reached the cave just as the storm broke in earnest, thunder rolling across the mountains as rain came down in sheets. Inside, the space was surprisingly deep, extending back into darkness. "Used to be a bear den," Garrett explained as he helped Hannah dismount, "but it's been empty for years. We'll be dry here, at least." They made a small fire near the cave entrance where the smoke could escape without filling their shelter. The horses, secured just inside, seemed content to be out of the deluge. "How's the ankle?" Garrett asked, gently helping Hannah remove her boot. "Better than yesterday," she replied truthfully. "Still sore, but the swelling's down." He examined it carefully, his touch sending shivers through her that had nothing to do with pain. "You're tougher than you look, Hannah Lawson," he said, a note of admiration in his voice. "So are you," she replied, studying his face in the firelight. "Most men would have left me to fend for myself at that creek." "Then most men are fools," he said simply, his hand moving from her ankle to capture her fingers. The storm raged outside, but within the cave, a different kind of storm was brewing between them. When Garrett kissed her this time, there was a hunger in it that hadn't been there before, a need that matched her own rising desire. "I'm falling in love with you," he confessed against her lips. "No, it's too soon to say such things, but it's the truth all the same." Hannah's heart soared at his words. "It doesn't feel too soon to me," she whispered back. "I think I started falling the moment you said you'd carry me." His laugh was soft and warm against her skin. "Best impulsive thing I ever said." They slept curled together that night, finding comfort in each other's arms as the storm gradually subsided outside. By morning, the world was washed clean, sunlight glinting off wet leaves and rain-polished rocks. Their journey continued, now with a new lightness between them despite the danger that still pursued them. They spoke of futures, of possibilities, of dreams that might be shared. By the third day, Helena was within reach, its buildings visible in the valley below. "We made it," Hannah said, relief evident in her voice as they paused on a ridge overlooking the town. "Not quite yet," Garrett cautioned. "Tucker's influence reaches even here. We need to get you directly to the federal marshal's office without being seen." They entered town as dusk was falling, taking back alleys and side streets to avoid the main thoroughfares. At the marshal's office, they found a gray-haired man with a stern face and alert eyes. "Marshal Wilson," Garrett greeted him. "This is Hannah Lawson." She witnessed the Jenkins murder in Clearwater. The marshal's eyebrows rose. "Been waiting for a witness to come forward on that one. Tucker's men did it, I presume?" Hannah nodded. "3 of them. I can identify each one." What followed was hours of questions, statements, and sworn testimony. By the time they finished, it was well past midnight. Marshal Wilson leaned back in his chair, regarding them both. "This is enough to arrest Tucker's men," he said. "Maybe even Tucker himself if one of them talks, but you'll both need protection until the trial." "Both?" Garrett asked. "Tucker's not a man to leave loose ends," Wilson replied grimly. "You helped her escape. That makes you a target too." They were given rooms in a small hotel under the marshal's protection. As they stood in the hallway between their doors, Hannah felt a curious mix of relief and apprehension. "It's not over yet," she said softly. Garrett took her hands in his. "No, but we've made it this far. The rest we'll face together." "Together," she repeated, liking the sound of the word on her lips. "I like that plan." His kiss was gentle, a promise rather than a demand. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's another day." The trial came 3 weeks later, after Tucker and his men were arrested. Hannah testified clearly and confidently, her evidence corroborated by other witnesses who found the courage to come forward once Tucker was behind bars. Throughout it all, Garrett remained by her side, a steady presence as the truth of Tucker's crimes was laid bare. The railroad man's empire crumbled as evidence of land fraud, intimidation, and murder mounted against him. When the verdicts came down guilty on all counts, Hannah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. That evening, Garrett took her to dinner at the finest restaurant in Helena, a celebration of their victory and the future that now lay open before them. "I've been thinking," he said as they walked back to their hotel under a star-filled sky. "Joe's getting older, says he wants to sell his share of the ranch." "Oh." Hannah's heart quickened at the direction of the conversation. "Been saving up," Garrett continued. "Almost have enough to buy him out. Would need to build a proper house, of course. The cabin's too small for." He hesitated, then took her hand, stopping their walk. "For a family." Hannah looked up at him, at this man who had carried her to safety, who had stood by her through danger and uncertainty, who had shown her what true courage and devotion meant. "Are you asking me something, Garrett O'Malley?" she prompted gently. He took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee right there on the boardwalk. "Hannah Lawson, I know it's only been a few weeks, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will." He stood and gathered her into his arms, his kiss speaking of promises and passion and a future built together. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, Hannah rested her head against his chest. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "Clearwater still needs a schoolteacher, and it's not far from your ranch." "Our ranch," he corrected, his arms tightening around her. "And that sounds like a perfect plan to me." 3 months later, they stood together on the porch of their newly built home, a modest but solid house overlooking the valley where Garrett's cattle grazed. Hannah's school was flourishing in town, and Garrett's ranch was prospering under his careful management. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. Hannah leaned into his embrace, her wedding ring catching the fading light. "More than I ever thought possible." "Good," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. Because I plan to spend the rest of my days making sure you stay that way. She turned in his arms, her eyes meeting his. Remember what you said that first day about carrying me all your life? I remember, he said softly, and I meant every word. I believe you did, Hannah replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him as the last rays of sunlight gilded their home, their land, their future together. And I plan to hold you to it.